make sure that you have most of your time today to actually start trying to run your data analysis and asking questions and have them do it to help you with it. So, first thing, as I was driving in today for week 9, I was told that I may have to go to DC for an executive board meeting week 10, so I may or may not have class. If we do not have class at the regular time, what I'll do is I'll set up 3 or 4 Zoom times where you could come into my Zoom office and I can answer your questions and help you get through these last week 10, I was going to have it just open for you to do your final project anyway. We weren't really going to be doing anything. And so I went back and added in, I'll go over the one video that's in week 10 today so that you have that information to ask me questions. And then I'll send out an announcement about what's going to happen this weekend. I may, and I'm trying really hard to be here because I really don't want to go. But I may not. So that's for week 10, and I'll just let you know about that. Don't forget that your survey article critique, I've seen that some of you have submitted it already. And I think I have 2 notes from people that want me to just look at them real quick, just to see if they're a good article, if they're the way it needs to be, and you can resubmit if you need to. Yeah, you can submit those early and just, send me a note if you want me to just look at it real quick and let you know if it looks good. So I'll look at those, the ones that have already been submitted, I'll look at those probably. Then we'll talk about this survey analysis report. That's just your project report. And the video for week 10 and what we'll talk about a little bit today is just how that report is different than like a research proposal that you might write for a business kind of job. I really want you to be writing a report like you would for your survey. And we'll talk about that more. And then we'll do our regular thing, our reviews and our stuff. So there's the information for your survey analysis report. What's here in red is what needs to be included. So you should have your descriptive statistics or your descriptive results for all of your research questions. So your survey research questions. You should be showing how your survey research questions are answered. You should have an item analysis on those Likert scales. This is why you need to have at least 5 questions that were a Likert scale, so that you can just throw them into an item analysis. We're not going to go over item analysis that much because there's other classes that do that, but there is a video on how to run an item analysis, and then all the only information you need is did the items come together or did they not, and what's your reliability, and what's your cutoff on those item analysis. And these descriptive results for your Likert scale items is just the total score. So it's looking at what is your total score, and so what is your mean for that measure, for those items that were supposed to be coming together as a measure. And then you should have at least one correlation in there where you're taking your item and then your validation item and correlating. If you have 2 items that are Likert scale where they're both categorical, you just have to make sure you're using that Spearman's rho correlation for the categorical variable instead of the Pearson. So you should have at least, in your report, you should have at least one of those correlations to show that you're validating your question. Again, most of this is just, it may not relate to your survey, but I wanted to make sure you knew how to do these and how to report them. So you should have at least one in there, even if it's this one question is validating this other question, here's the correlation between them. And it should have a high correlation. If they're both measuring the same thing and collecting that same data, they should be pretty high. If it's you want to do your Likert scale where you have like 5 items that were measuring satisfaction, and then you had one validation question that's, are you satisfied? You do the correlation between that are you satisfied question and the total score from all those rigid scale items. That's the correlation that you use. To be able to say these two are highly correlated, meaning they're both measuring the satisfaction appropriately. And if they're not, then you just report that. And that's probably good information to know at this point before you go use your surveys somewhere else. And then just any of these inferential statistics. So these are your t-tests, your ANOVAs, your correlations, your regressions that you're going to use to answer your research questions. And we'll talk a little bit more about those here in a minute. But any questions on this stuff? Okay, let me know as you start working on this what questions come up. This shouldn't be any more than 8 to 10 pages, double spaced. But what you'll see is that there is a part of a survey research report where you can put all of your tables and graphs that aren't necessarily important, but they need to be in there somewhere. So you could end up with a report that's 20 pages, but half of them are like appendices where they're just graphs that you're not using. So it's more like you just want to show me that you did it, but it's not in your report. Yeah. Okay. All right, so for the review today, I'm going to run through these 4 things pretty quickly because I'd rather have you in SPSS, in Excel, actually doing the work because everybody's going to be a little bit different, and that's when you're going to run into your questions. So I want to make sure that we have the time to answer those specific individual questions. So we'll look at just the general steps for data analysis, the equations that you'll run into while you're doing data analysis. We'll talk a little bit about item analysis. And then I did add that week 10 on there, which is just a report, how to put a survey research report together. All right. So you have to first think about the difference between your survey as a measure or measurement and your survey as a data collection tool. And remember that you're collecting these different data for different reasons. So if your survey is a measure or it has a measure within it, that's when you're using the item analysis. And pretty much your item analysis is most of what you'll get for that measure. You'll get the total score, and that's what you're using. So you're using a total score or scale score as the variable from that measure. The steps that we're going to go over are 4 data collection tools. These are what, like, nobody tells you. Like, you can't find them anywhere because everyone always wants to talk about survey as a measure. But we'll talk about what are the different parts and pieces you need when you're surveying a data collection tool. And remember that even if you have a survey that's a measure, you can pull out different items and use those like you would in a data collection tool. So if you're interested in 1 or 2 items that are within the measure, you can pull them out and do your analysis the same way as if you had a full data collection tool. All right, so these 10 items aren't necessarily in this order. I kind of tried to chunk them in what you would do first, second, and third. But depending on your data, depending on your survey research design and your sampling design, 1 or more of these steps may be moved around, and 1 or more of these steps may be more intensive for you than for somebody else, because they're really specific to your survey. So, the first 3 kind of bunched together in these are what you do to be able to look at what are those differences between your sample and your population. So when you first developed your sampling design and you figured out what your sample needed to look like to be representative of your population, you need to use that same information to now determine how your actual sample of the data you collected is different from your population. So you're doing a comparison of your sample data to your population data. So that's where you're looking at what is the percentage of males and females for the population, what is it for the sample? What is the the percentages for your race ethnicities, for the population, for your sample? And go through it. It's mostly going to be, you're mostly going to look at two things. Your demographics are the participant characteristics, because you want your sample to be representative of the population. But you also want to look at some of your key variables. So if you have like a satisfaction scale, you might want to look at the total score with some of those characteristics or demographics before you actually start doing analysis and your interpretation, just so you know what's going on. When you find differences between your sample and your population where you need to have weights, then you have to calculate these weights. So this is where we had the example where we talked about if in the population it's 50% male, 50% female, but in your sample you have 60% males and 40% females, then you have to develop a weight for that characteristic of sex of male, female, that then needs to be included when you are calculating your estimates from your sample. So basically what you're doing is you're taking into account that error from your sample. So your sample has error in that it's different than your population by this amount. That's what that weight is. So it's trying to adjust your sample and the responses you have to ensure that your sample is truly representative of your population. Now, if you've done a really good job of your sampling design and getting all of your participants to actually participate, you won't have to do these weights. And really, that's the goal, is to have a really good sampling design that you pre-planned and thought about ahead of time, that you monitored as the data was coming in, so that you don't have to do these weights. Because you can imagine, if you have to add weights in for male versus female, for race ethnicity, for age, for income, and all of these different variables, now your sample estimates, one, you're adding a whole lot of error in there. And it's going to get really complex on including all of those weights within your calculations. So that's kind of the first thing that you do, is you look at how different is the data that I actually collected from my survey from the population that it's supposed to represent. And is it different enough? So is that error big enough where it makes sense for me to add in these weights to try and make sure that it's really representative of the population? And you have to, weigh those pros and cons, because if you see that, all right, a couple of these demographics, I have to use the weights because they're very different, but others, they're not so far off that I want to, make my estimates even more complex by adding weights. So you have to make some of those decisions. Usually, it's like 5 to 10% difference is when you kind of really want to make sure that you're adequate. How do you add the weights? Well, we'll see this here.
Oh, okay.
So that's how you calculate the weight, is what was your expected percentage in decimal format divided by what you actually obtained. That's how you get the weight. And there's ways in Excel and SPSS to add the weight in when it's doing the calculation, but I actually like to add my own weights in ahead of time because I like to be able to see, here's my variable, here's my weighted variable. Yeah. And then you get a lot of them, then you can have like your one variable, you're like, oh, my survey is super easy, I'm just measuring satisfaction. But oh, look, here's my satisfaction score by itself. Here's when it's weighted for males, here's when it's weighted for females, here's when it's weighted for each of the races and ethnicities, and here's where we put it all together. And you get really complex. But I actually like adding those weights in, just because I like to be able to see how those estimates are changing. I like to be able to, like, if I know I'm doing a t-test of, like, between groups, like versus male versus female, I want to be able to see how those weights are changing. Because we do have this assumption that you're making with those weights is that anybody that didn't respond, you're making the assumption that they would have responded like those that responded. So you really have to think about that in your interpretation of, all right, am I changing these estimates so much that I'm weighing too heavily on this assumption that people that didn't respond would have responded the same way. So like with our example of our 60-40, for our female that should have been 50-50, we're assuming that that 50% in the population of females is going to answer the same way as the 40% of our sample. So you could be adding more error adding in your weight than not. So I like to just keep track of how those weights are changing my estimates. And again, the ultimate goal is that you have such a really good sampling design that you don't have to add those weights in. That's why you should have a really good plan of what your sampling design is before you begin, and you should be monitoring it as you go. So if you start seeing, oh man, females aren't answering, I may need to send this out more to more females to make sure that my sample really is representative. It'd be better to do that than to try and add all these weights. Okay, so that's like these first three. These next two kind of go together. So you have to think about how are you going to deal with non-response. So how are you going to deal with the people that didn't respond? Are you just going to get rid of them? Or will you have to try and fill in some of those blanks? So this is the same thing that we think about with missingness in other research. Like if you have a variable where you just have a lot of missingness, you have to decide, where am I going to remove the participants that just don't have this value, or am I going to do some kind of imputation? So this is like a mean imputation, where you substitute the mean in for each of those that's missing. Or you substitute some other value in places where a participant didn't respond. The problem with that, again, is it changes your interpretation. And it changes how you can talk about your results. Because if you're putting the mean in for all of those missing, now your mean is no longer the mean. You're actually interpreting. So the preference is to just get rid of those non-response, or to do such a great job collecting survey data and getting people to respond that you have a perfect response rate. That's the goal, but good luck. But again, that's something that you can monitor as you're going. And you should think about, remember when we talk about code, that you should know ahead of time how you're coding for those missing. And you should also know ahead of time how are you going to deal with those missing. So if somebody answered all the questions but one, how are you going to deal with that person versus somebody that didn't answer any at all? So that's deciding on how to deal with your non-response, because that can impact your estimates as well. And then also the adjustments for the different probabilities of selection. So this was where if we did stratification, and so you knew from your sample that you needed to get very specific percentages of certain groups, of subgroups. This is where we talk about the different grades, where if you're looking at all grades, K is 5, and K only had 10, but grade 5 had 100. How do you make sure that you don't lose all your kindergartners, that they're still represented in there somehow, some way? So their probability of selection is going to be different for the kindergartners than for the fifth graders. So you're not just doing a random selection where every person listed has the same probability of being selected. So again, that's part of your sampling design. So you should already know that this is going to happen and that you're going to need to add in weights for those probabilities of selection. Okay, questions so far? Okay. Then calculating your sampling errors. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we look at the equation. But that is really figuring out what's that difference between your sample and your population. And so number 6 kind of goes along with number 9 with your confidence intervals. Remember, your confidence intervals are establishing that range with your error of where the population value could be. So if we say the mean for the sample is right here, we can't say we know for sure that the population mean is exactly the same. You do that calculation of your standard error, and that gives you the plus or minus on either end of that estimate. So you could say our sample mean is 5, but our population mean is going to be somewhere between 3 and 7. So those two kind of go together. But I put this confidence interval here because it's usually you're adding your confidence intervals to the estimates you get from your inferential statistics. So your inferential statistics, those are any of your statistics where you're getting statistical significance. When you're getting a p-value or you're doing a comparison to a critical value to determine what's significant. Your inferential statistics are the only ones that you can add a confidence interval on and infer back to the population as a whole. Surveys are a little bit tricky where usually you see everybody using just those descriptive statistics. They just want to use their means and their percentages from their sample and talk about the population as a whole. And really that's a big no-no. So you see this a lot of times in marketing surveys, commercials, a lot of political commercials and all of that, where they're saying, oh, 50% of people said, but it's only, 10 people that live in the same neighborhood as the surveyor. So it's just using those descriptive statistics. It's not actually going through and using the inferential statistics to really be able to say, we can take this statistic or this estimate from our sample and relate it back to the whole population. So, but descriptive statistics are used a lot more in the reporting of survey results. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the test section. This number 10 is probably the only thing that really belongs right in the spot. And it'll be in the same spot for everybody. Because after you've done all this, then you can generalize those statistics back to the population parameters. And talk about which one actually can relate back to the population and how well with your confidence intervals. But you have to go through all of this. All right, I give you a whole lot more detail in the video that's on there. So let's look at these equations real quick. So the first one is the one we talked about where it's the weighting. I didn't put any equations in for these missingness imputations because usually the program will do it for you. So if you decide you want to do a mean imputation where anybody that didn't respond to, you know, all of your satisfaction items, so you can't get a measured score for them or a total score for them, and you want to just put in the mean for everybody that did answer, you can do that in SPSS. But again, if at all possible, you probably want to just get rid of those non-responses and not do imputation, because then trying to explain to people why the mean changed and why the mean is what it is more difficult than just not including. So it changes your interpretation, but you can look up these different missingness imputations and use it for your non-response. Then these last three go together. You've seen these already, but this is where it's the calculation of the standard error. Where variance here is where you have this characteristic. So this is saying like, what is the variance when we look at males versus females? So what's the percentage of females? What's the percentage of males? Make sense? Over your sample size. So you plug and chug that, and so then when you get your standard error, that becomes your plus and minus for your confidence interval. So if you're doing like your mean and you calculate your standard error, then you could say, oh, we know that our sample mean is 5, and with our standard error of 2, we know that the population mean is going to be between 3 and 7. And that's what we're looking for. But remember again that I told you that there are tables and calculators online that'll calculate your confidence intervals for you, so that you can get those to be able to work on it. So you don't actually have to do this calculation. I like doing the calculations, I know most people don't. So there are those options. Any questions about these? I think the only one you haven't seen before is that weight one. But it's pretty much the same as when you're looking at your stratification. Like if you're doing the stratification, you're figuring out the probability of selection. Very similar to that. The other one that's not on here is your response rate. So your response rate is just how many answered and divided by how many actually were sent to survey. So if you're figuring out your non-response, your response rate. That's the only other one that's on.
I was taking notes, but what's sample size estimate? Is that just like a fancy way of saying sample size?
So you have to say the sample size of the estimate. So like, it's like if your estimate is your mean, where you're trying to say, here's our sample mean, and we want to find the confidence interval for the population.
Oh, okay.
It's just the sample size that you use to get your estimate.
Okay.
So if, say, you have 100 people that actually responded, but only 70 of them responded with the numbers you needed to get the mean, so then that would be 79.
Okay. Okay.
But it's for a different variable. So if you have satisfaction and motivation, for satisfaction it might only be 70, but for motivation it might be everybody answered, so that's 100 there. That makes sense.
Now I'm just thinking about variance.
Yeah.
So for the response rate, if we would
yeah, that's when we like talk about like your sampling design and how tricky that can get.
Yeah.
because you're going to have a hard time doing your response rate, and you'll have a hard time doing your probability of selection. So typically, you don't want to use that kind of sampling design because you can't do those calculations. But for this class and for your like reporting, just do some estimates. So you just say how you did your sampling, you estimate that the survey got to this many people, and this is how many actually responded. Yeah.
Did you like, do you know how many people started the survey but didn't finish it because you realized the number that was students started?
Good. You just have to explain, because remember there was that whole website of all the different ways that you could calculate response rate, and everybody calculates their response rate differently. So you just have to make sure that you're very clear about how you're calculating your response rate and who's included in that numerator and who's included in that denominator. And how you determine those loads. So just make sure that it's equal. Any other questions here? Okay. So for your item analysis, just really quickly, your item analysis, I did put a video in there to show you how to do an item analysis in SPSS. So you can just follow along with that and just run through it. Really all your item analysis is looking at are all the items that are supposed to be in the measure actually working. And so you just want your overall reliability, which is your Chromebox Alpha, to be above 0.6. For this class, that's all you need to report. There's other classes that will go into this more deeply and give you a lot more information. You just need to know that if you are doing a survey that has a measure, either as part of it or the whole survey is a measure, if this item analysis is a big part of the data analysis for that survey. It's basically proving that you have reliability for those items in the measure.
But not for a data collection tool?
Because remember, for a data collection tool, each item is measuring something different. Yeah, this is just for a measure. Oh yeah, this is one of Kathy's here, so I like.
Oh. Drop it.
Yeah, so then it's just, you just want to report your Chromebox output. These slides are in the in-class for today, so you can look at them more deeply. I don't need all of that. I just need to know that you ran an item analysis for your Likert scale items that are supposed to be working together in the measure, and just give me the Chromebox output. If it's 0.6 or above, then you have good reliability, and you can just say that. If it's below 0.6, then you say, oh, some of the items aren't working well together because there's low reliability, and that's it. I don't need anything. I don't need anything. We're not going to go through that.
So what kind of report do you want for data collection tool
Ta-da!
Oh, okay.
So this is all in that video that I put in for week 10. So really the biggest thing for your survey research report is your audience is different than when it's like a research report for a journal article or for a conference presentation. With a lot of times with your survey, you're reporting to the stakeholders, you're reporting to the participants, because it's supposed to be important to them. And so you want to make sure that it makes sense for them. And so you have a lot of the same information, just different things are emphasized, and you don't get as technical. Because, you know, your stakeholders that are interested in what your survey results are telling them don't care if you did a data analysis and an item analysis and, you know, validated, but they probably aren't even going to look at that. So, what you usually start with in your survey research report is an executive summary. Your executive summary is kind of like an amped up abstract, where it includes all of your results, all of your major results, your action items that are related to those results, and anything that's going to be important to the audience you're presenting to as stakeholders. So, for example, we have all of these surveys that I have to regularly look at for the satisfaction of students towards teachers. I'm not going to tell teachers all the crazy information about how I did an item analysis and all that. I'm going to tell them, hey, your students really like how you present stuff in your live sessions online, but they're really struggling with you not responding to their emails for 2 weeks. So you really need to know who's this information going to be important for? Who are those action items for? And that's who you're writing it for. So when you're writing a survey research report that's not for a research audience, all of your big important stuff comes right up front. You don't wait till the end for it. Then you have your survey objectives and a brief literature review. This again is a big difference, where when you're writing for the research community, they want to know what you're basing all this research on, and where is the gap, and how did you identify the gap in the research. That's those big, bulky literature reviews that you usually see in the research article, and that people want in the research articles. Most of the time, survey stakeholders and the audience for surveys do not want all that. They just want enough information to know what are your research questions or objectives. We usually don't even call them research questions in these type of reports. We call them the objectives. Why we did this. Why is it important? They just want the information to know why you did the survey, why it's important. And then you get to your survey design. This again is another big difference. In an actual research journal article where you're talking about how you designed the survey and how the items worked and what you changed and the questions, and they don't want all that. It's very, very brief, to the point. Here's my sample and design. I decided to collect this data in this way from these people. Like, usually this is very, very short. Because again, your audience is different. If you're writing up this information for an actual research journal article, this is your biggest part, because you're talking about how you designed the survey and how you put it together and how you validated it, not for these kinds of reports. Then your survey results is actually what the bulk is. Because that's the part that this audience is really going to care about. So teachers really want to know about how their students are answering these satisfaction questions, and in what ways. Because those are what lead to action items. And usually these types of survey research, so with data collection tools, surveys in particular, you want to get action items. So you should include your descriptive and your inferential statistics, but you really have to pay attention to what is essential to telling the story. What I usually tell people is, if you're creating a report, if somebody goes through and only looks at your graphs, charts, and tables, they only want to look at the pictures, they don't want to actually read what you wrote, they should still be able to get the same story, the same information as what you have written. Same thing if somebody decides they only want to read what you wrote and not look at your tables and your charts. They should be able to get the same story, the same information the same action items from there. A lot of the times with these kinds of reports, people are actually just looking through and they're just looking at your graphs, they're just looking at your tables, they're just looking at your charts. So you have to be very strategic in what tables and charts and graphs do you include to make sure that you're telling the story. And this is one of the few places where you use the captions. So if you have a graph and you say, this graph along with this inferential statistic gives us this action item, that should be in the caption. So if they're only looking at that graph, they get the whole story. This is the big difference. Then all of those non-essential graphs, where when you have somebody that is a researcher and wants all that extra stuff, it all goes in appendices. So it's all in there somewhere. You just have to be very strategic in thinking about what graphs, charts, and tables actually tell the story that I need to tell, and give the action items that need to come from this survey research, and what doesn't. It does, then it goes up here as part of your survey research results. If it doesn't, it still belongs in the appendix. So for your survey analysis reports, they'll look more like this. I don't want a research proposal. You learn how to write research proposals all over town around here. I want you to have an opportunity of writing up this kind of report. Because a lot of times, once you leave here, this may be what you're expected to do more often than writing research proposals. So it would be good to be able to figure out how to put your information in this format. Okay, questions? Yeah.
Can you talk again about action items? How are they different from the research objectives?
So if your research objectives are something like, we want to measure satisfaction of students towards teachers. But then your action items are based on your results. So if one of your items is, how satisfied are you with your teacher's response time? And they're not satisfied. Then an action item is, oh, teachers, we need to work on response time. Or if you're an admin or a principal or something, then it's putting a policy in place that there's a 48-hour response time. And so then that's the action item. Does that make sense? So you can have a lot. So you might only have one research question or research objective, but you can have a lot of action items that come from it. Other questions? Okay. So, I'm going to give you the rest of the time to be able to work on your data analysis. For your application journal for this week, it really is just asking what is the data analysis that you'll actually conduct, or that you have conducted or you will conduct, and how does it answer your research questions, which you should already know. So that's what your application journal is. Like I said, if I'm not going to be here next week, I'll make sure to send out an announcement, and I'll schedule a couple of Zoom times where I'll just be sitting on Zoom for a couple hours and you can pop in and ask questions. But you still can absolutely get a hold of me through Canvas email or question answer discussion board as you're working through this stuff. All right, I'm here. So start looking at your data, figuring out what you need to do. Let me know what questions you have. If you're having a hard time, just start with the steps.